Okay, it is 9:01, so we will get started now. Thank you everybody for attending. My name is Mike Giardini. I am a communications officer with CNL Stakeholder Relations team. I will be the host of today's webinar. Today's webinar is on CNL's Integrated Waste Strategy, NSDF as a key enabling facility. But before we get started, CRL is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As an organization, CNL recognizes and appreciates their connection to this place. CNL also recognizes the contributions that First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made, both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and this province and country as a whole. We'll start with the presentation and then open the floor for Q&A discussion period. So today's presenters are Sean Gamley and a introduction by Nicole LeBlanc. So there is simultaneous interpretation of this discussion. So if you'd like to hear it in French, there is a globe icon on the bottom right of your screen or the Zoom bar. So you can select the language you prefer. Today's session is planned for about 1 hour with the presentation about 30 minutes, and then the rest will be for Q&A. To submit a question, you have to type it in to the Q&A function, and then we will take it up at any time. You can type it in, and then we'll take it up at the end. And I will read the questions to Sean. We are recording these sessions because we like to post them on YouTube afterwards. So just to let you know, and if you have any issues with any of this, you can email ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and we will get to your email and try to help you out as best we can. So today's panelists are Sean Gamley. He's the manager of planning and waste strategy, and supporting Sean today is Nicole LeBlanc, who is a senior communications officer. Nicole will kick things off this morning. So Nicole, over to you.
Good morning. Thanks, Mike. As mentioned, I'm a senior communications officer with the Environmental Remediation Management Stakeholder Relations team. Just wanted to touch base with you this morning on an update on the NSDF hearing process. So the slide in front of you today talks about topics that we have done in the past related to Indigenous and public comments on the NSDF project. We haven't been in front of the public in a few months. We have last met in November. So I wanted to just give a recap on the NSDF hearing process and where we are today with that. So as many of you may be aware, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission held a two-part hearing on the NSDF project. Part one was held in February of 2022. And part two was held in June of 2022. On June 30th, the Commission announced that the hearing record would remain open to allow more time for information regarding engagement and consultation efforts in respect to Kabuak First Nation and Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe. The filing deadline at that time was January 31st. On December 22nd, after receiving procedural requests from Kabuak and Kitigan-Zibi, the President of the Commission extended the filing deadline. The new deadline is now May 1st, 2023. And in addition to the extension, as requested by the Indigenous communities, the Commission will now allow final submissions by Indigenous nations and communities that made oral interventions during part two my apologies. In addition to the extension, the Commission will now allow for oral final submissions by Indigenous nations and communities that made oral interventions during part two will now be allowed on record and scheduled for June 27th. This hearing oral presentation will be in the Ottawa-Gatineau area and offer a virtual component as well. Interveners who also made oral submissions during part two of the public hearing will also have an option to provide a written submission. So on the slide, the deadlines are noted. Filing deadline is May 1st for any written submissions. And again, to re-announce, June 27th will be the oral presentations from Indigenous nations and communities. Happy to answer any questions if you want to put them in the chat. I will note that this process is the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's process. We may be able to answer high-level questions, but any detailed or procedural questions must be directed to the CNSC. Thanks, Mike. I'll now hand it over to Sean Gamley. He'll take on the NSDF component of this particular webinar. It's on the integrated waste strategy, and over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Mike. So as Mike said, my name is Sean. I'm speaking today on behalf of our waste strategy team at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, CNL, but indirectly I've got the privilege of speaking on behalf of hundreds of people that are involved in waste management across CNL and across Canada, really. So it really is a privilege to be here today, and I'm happy to be able to speak to, I think there's about 50 people on today, so that's fantastic. If you want to go to the next slide, Rachel, I'll get right into what the CNL integrated waste strategy is. So the CNL IWS, and I'll try to keep the acronyms and abbreviations limited for the most part, but the IWS is something that's been around for about 6 years now, and it is the framework for the life cycle management of all types of waste at all CNL managed sites across Canada. So when we talk all types of waste, we're talking clean, hazardous, radioactive, and solid and liquid. The focus of this presentation will be really on the low-level waste, which is a subclass of radioactive waste, particularly on the basis of how it relates to the NSDF project, which I think a lot of people on this call will be quite familiar with. So when we're talking the CNL integrated waste strategy, we need to recognize that it both reflects and informs decisions. So when we're saying the waste strategy, it includes projects that are already underway. The NSDF being a prime example of that, NPD and WR1 projects as well. And really any of our other projects are not designated projects, but are still critically important to enabling us to manage our wastes safely and responsibly. We also use the IWS as a tool to inform decision-making. So when you're talking framework, it lays out guiding principles. It lays out the strategic vision of what good looks like. And in that way, it is an input into future decisions. And that's the key part of the IWS, where it reflects our history, it reflects where we are now, and it also plots the path forward. And that's what the IWS sort of value is. It provides a holistic and integrated life cycle plan to make sure that we're efficient and effective in managing all of the waste that CNL is responsible for managing on behalf of Atomic Energy of Canada, AECL, who owns all of that waste. If you want to go to the next slide, please, Rachel. So IWS places emphasis on three main categories. It talks about where are we today? And when we're talking about where we are today, it talks about the history that got us here. It talks about how radioactive waste has been safely managed at CNL operated sites in the 1950s. So we're in decade 8 of doing that. It talks about where do we want to go? Whenever you're talking strategy, you're talking the future. You're talking what do we need to do to be better? What do we need to do to manage these liabilities in a life cycle approach, which means what does the end look like? And then from that, when you have your vision and you've got your strategy, you start talking what actions do we need to take to get there, which is also known as the implementation plan or the action plan. But the IWS really outlines key actions that allow us to enable the where do we want to get to. And one of the key parts of figuring out where do we want to get to and how are we going to get there is engagement. So mechanisms like this, but probably more when we're in a smaller group, whether that's presenting to our Environmental Stewardship Council or having an internal meeting with different sites. It's getting different perspectives and understanding where are we, what needs improvement, and really what we want to do over the coming decades. And that is the IWS. It looks at a very long time horizon. And that gives us a lot of freedom and flexibility to figure out what is the best path for CNL. On the slide here, you'll see on the left-hand side the graphics of where we are today. So that's some of our current practices for waste management CNL operated sites. On the right-hand side, you can see where do we want to get to, and we look at the really important role that new facilities play in enabling us to safely and effectively manage our waste liabilities across Canada. So some of those facilities people are probably very familiar with. The bottom left one on the right-hand half is NSDF. Some of the other ones are at the design stage or at the really early concept stage, and they're just sort of showing how we need to build up new capabilities, new infrastructure, new facilities to allow us to manage the waste. So that's actually a really big part of the integrated waste strategy is the infrastructure need. Going back to the left-hand side of the screen, I'm just going to point out that in the top left on the screen where we're looking at doing retrievals from a historical cylindrical bunker, that's actually outdated over the past couple of years, where now we've improved our processes. So people don't actually have to go into the bunker to enable us to retrieve the low-level waste from that bunker. We've figured out a way to make it all remote. So it's kind of outdated where it's not where we are today, but very recently we found a way to make it better. Next slide, please, Rachel. So this is the tiered response, sort of the tiered overview of CNL's integrated waste strategy. So when we talk integrated waste strategy with a capital I, we talk about a summary document. That summary document is publicly available right now. The last version that was released was in 2019, and we are currently finalizing the next revision, which is Rev 2. That will be completed internally in English in March. It'll then undergo French translation and will be released later on in 2023. And that will be posted publicly. But for anybody that does want to see the IWS as it stands today in its published form, all you have to do is go into Google or search engine of your choice, type in CNL Integrated Waste Strategy, and it will take you to the link. When we're talking CNL's waste strategy on a broad forum, and not that capital I integrated waste strategy, we're talking about all of what you see on here. We're talking site-specific strategies, whether that's Chalk River or Whiteshell or Port Hope or Gentilly or the Northern Transportation Route. You're talking project-specific plans. So this is things like a cleanup project, Building 250, which is a webinar in 45 minutes on, or the NSDF project about how that's a critically enabling facility for us to safely manage low-level waste in a permanent way. And then you look at all of the underpinning for project-specific plans that go up into the site-specific plans. We're talking options analysis, technical plans, and then beneath that, it's based on a waste inventory. How much waste do we have? How much waste are we going to generate? And when we look at it, when you're looking IWS, one document. When you're looking site-specific strategies, you're looking 6 or so. When you're looking project-specific plans, you're getting into the hundreds. When you're looking at options analysis and technical plans, you're getting into the thousands. And then when you're looking at waste inventory and forecast, there's hundreds of thousands of data points that contribute to that. So the IWS, capital I in this case, is the summary document that is underpinned by all of that. And when we're talking CNL's waste strategy, we do it in an integrated way. And when we're looking at different sites, we see how they all interact and interface with the other ones to make sure we're making the best decisions on that scale of what's best for CNL. Next slide, please, Rachel. All right, the waste management life cycle. So I think most people will be familiar with this that have sort of read the IWS or have read some of our other documentation. This is presented a little bit differently now compared to what you might have seen though, where historically we sort of shown it in a linear pathway of planning, generation, processing, storage, and then end of life or disposal, depending on what we called it. Now we sort of recognize that it's more iterative. There's more back and forth, and that's the reality of dealing with waste that's been generated over multiple decades, going back to the 50s. And so we go from planning to generation, Generation then might go straight to storage. We can process it, or we can pre-treat it to make it suitable for storage. Then it sometimes go to processing. Sometimes it doesn't need to. It really depends on the specific waste form that we're dealing with and how we have to deal with it or manage it to enable the end of life. So I think a lot of people are familiar with Dr. Stephen Covey and the 7 habits of highly effective people. And he's got the very famous quote of begin with the end in mind. And that is a key element of CNL's waste life cycle of when we're going to generate waste, or even before we plan to generate waste, we're thinking, what are we going to do with this liability at the end? And when we're talking low-level waste in particular, we look at the NSDF, the Near Surface Disposal Facility, as giving a lot of clarity on what the end is. And that allows us to generate it, to process it, to package it in ways that it's going to be suitable for disposal in the NSDF. And all of the underpinning for that, the characterization, the extent of characterization needed, looking at things in a life cycle framework really helps make the process efficient, effective, and safe as possible. Next slide, please. All right, talking a little bit about the Canadian context for the CNL Integrated Waste Strategy. So the CNL Integrated Waste Strategy is something that CNL, that we write, but we recognize there's a lot of influences on the CNL Integrated Waste Strategy. And in the past year, or 18 months actually, there's been a lot of really interesting developments on radioactive waste frameworks in Canada. So I'll start with Natural Resources Canada, which is an organization for the Government of Canada. In 2020 and 2021, they started the process of modernizing Canada's policy for radioactive waste management and decommissioning. There is a draft available if you go on the NRCan website of that draft policy, but they really clarified some of the government's positions in terms of waste management. A couple highlights that I'll call out is the focus on transitioning to disposal infrastructure for radioactive waste, recognizing that we don't want to be doing a rolling stewardship of storage to storage, but we want to enable disposal. Also talks about transportation as a key element of waste management in Canada and the need to sort of consolidate at a select number of areas for disposal. And it talks about the need to act with a sense of urgency, the need to act now, the need to minimize the burden on future generations, because that is a big part of how in Canada we want to manage our radioactive wastes. On the right-hand side here, when we're talking the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, so the NWMO, who have historically been involved with developing the disposal solution for high-level waste in Canada. In 2020, the Minister of Natural Resources tasked the NWMO with developing a Canada-wide national integrated strategy for radioactive waste. This is focused on low and intermediate level waste, and it excludes projects already undergoing federal impact assessments. So it didn't look at the scope of NSDF and all of the waste estimate for that. It didn't look at NPD and WR1, but it looked at everything else. And it really echoed many of the same conclusions of the policy. And those are two major inputs to CNL's integrated waste strategy, where even though they are in draft form, we are continuously striving to align ourselves to the policy requirements and the strategy recommendations. And we'll highlight that they are still both in draft form. So there is that level of a bit of uncertainty on what the final product will look like. But those are external to CNL. They reside with NRCan and the NWMO respectively. Next slide. All right, when we're talking radioactive waste management at CNL, and again, re-emphasize when talking integrated waste strategy, we do include clean, hazardous, liquid, solid, but for the focus of the next sort of 10 minutes, I'll be talking mostly radioactive waste and sort of shifting to low level. So radioactive waste management at CNL sites. On this map here, you can see that there's a pretty big footprint across Canada in where CNL is operating and where we're managing radioactive waste, whether it's Whiteshell in Manitoba or I guess Chantilly 1 is our furthest east in Quebec, and the 4 sites in Ontario. there's a pretty substantial amount of radioactive waste that we manage. That is the product of decades of research and decades of contributing to the well-being of Canada. And one of the things that really stood out to me as I started getting involved with the strategy is you look at where did this waste come from? And there's the statistic that really stands out of when NIU was running and CNL was producing medical isotopes, those were being used to help 20 million people every year. And that operated for 60 years. So over 1 billion people benefited from the operation of that. And that's phenomenal. There's the reality that that created a waste that we now have to manage. And that is what we are now working on, is managing those liabilities safely, effectively, and efficiently. I want to go next. Actually, if you want to stay on this slide, I'll just highlight that the volumes presented here are approximate. If anybody does want to learn more about the specific volumes, I would encourage you to go to the NRCan publication called Inventory of Radioactive Waste in Canada, publicly available. Just put it into Google, and that will come up and will give you the very specific volumes that are currently generated and those in the forecast. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next 3 graphics are related to the evolution of practices in terms of radioactive waste management, divided by low-level waste, intermediate-level waste, and high-level waste. I'm not going to give the background on those 3 categories. I'm guessing most people are familiar with them, but low-level waste is sort of our least hazardous in that sort of class. So when you look at the slide here or this graphic, you see that there has been a steady evolution and a steady improvement of how we manage low-level waste, from putting waste in various types of in-ground structures to increasingly putting it above ground, recognizing that it's storage and making retrieval easier in the future. And how we're moving towards the future, which allows us to move from storage as part of a rolling stewardship framework to a disposal solution, which again really minimizes the burden on future generations. And with this, when we look at this evolution, I think it's really important to note that the historical practices are aligned to the industry best practices and regulations of the time. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, like you see on these, this was the best approach. But we've learned by leading in some ways, we've learned by learning from others in a lot of ways. And that has allowed us to continuously improve our approach, which makes it safer. It makes it safer for workers, it makes it safer for the public, and it protects the environment better. So that's that continuous evolution. If you want to go on to ILW now, Rachel? You'll see the same thing here of an evolution of practices where we went from sort of rectangular bunkers and tile holes and cylindrical bunkers to transitioning us, and this is a transition that is kind of live right now, to going to above ground storage configurations of ILW. And it's a transition that will take us many years. It'll take us actually decades to recover the material from the 6,000 underground structures at Chalk River alone, not to mention the ones at other sites. And it is that sort of continuous work of finding the best way to do it, the safest way, the most economical, that really works for us. They're not most economical, it is providing the best value for Canadians. On the far right hand here, we talk about a recommendation for a deep geological repository. And I'm going to emphasize that it is a recommendation. So in the NWMO integrated strategy for radioactive waste I talked about a couple slides ago, recommendation 2 talks about having a single ILW disposal facility that the NWMO would lead. And that provides the recommendation that we have as CNL and participating in that process of what ILW disposal could look like for the AECL-owned inventory. On to high-level waste. Similar trend, although we are further ahead in terms of transitioning to above ground storage to, again, make retrievals easier, more effective, more safe. And you'll see here that we're sort of in a continuous evolution of going to disposal. And I like the word evolution, if you haven't told, because it really tells a story of, it's not a hard stop. We don't say we're not going to do this and we're going to do this going forward. it recognizes that in our projects, they take many years to many decades to execute, and how that really is an important element of enabling the change. And I always sort of think of the book Atomic Habits by the author James Clear, and he said, you should be far more concerned with your current trajectory than your current results. And I think of that, and I think actually where we are, what we're doing is safe. It aligns to best practices. It aligns to the regulatory environment in Canada. It aligns to demonstrating safety. But the reality is we're putting a lot of focus on making it better, making it safer. And our current results are really good, but that focus and the support that we have from AECL on making it better really makes this a really interesting field to be working in right now. Next slide, please. This is just a quick recap of the disposal of AECL-owned radioactive waste. So low-level waste, obviously the proposed path, and it is a proposed path, not a final path because we're going through the regulatory approval processes, is the NSDF that is being led by CNL with oversight by AECL. Plan is for operational readiness in about 2030. ILW, like I mentioned, current recommendation is for a DGR operated by the NWMO, and that would sort of be operational in around the timeline of 2050, and location is very much a to be determined, and that would be sort of subject to a lot of engagement activities. High-level waste, this is a path that has been sort of blazed already, where NWMO has been leading it for about 25 years, and they're looking at 2 candidate sites, either the South Bruce area or the Ignis area in northwestern Ontario. And that's planned to be operational in about 20 to 25 years from now. But that is where we sort of foresee and strategize that the AECL-owned inventory of radioactive waste will be disposed of going forward. Next slide. The role of the NSDF, I think for those that have participated in a few of the different webinars today, they're probably pretty familiar with some of these elements and the role of the NSDF, but figured it'd be good to reiterate them because these are key elements of the CNL integrated waste strategy. The NSDF obviously is a key element of allowing us to clean up sites. When we're talking Chalk River and our legacy waste management areas, we recognize that those need to be cleaned up and remediated. And the NSDF is the facility that will enable us to pursue that large scale remediation because it gives us a place to put the waste safely and permanently. When we're looking at the NSDF and all of the different components, predominantly the engineered containment mound, we're looking at using a proven, environmentally sound and safe solution. And that really is a big element of the next slide that I'll talk about innovation. But the NSDF is something that's new to Canada, but it's not new to the world. This approach is sort of proven on many different sites in many different countries in different regulatory regimes. And that's the reason why it was chosen amongst various alternatives as the right approach for CNL. Final point here is, oh, sorry, Rachel, if you don't want to go back, thank you. Final point here is that the NSDF allows us to move towards a permanent solution. And this allows us to act now to clean up the grounds, the legacy areas, facilities that are above ground that need to be decommissioned to revitalize a site. It allows us to deal with it within this generation and recognize the NSDF is going to operate for 50 years. So we're still talking a long time. It really sort of minimizes that burden on our children and our grandchildren and the people that will come after us and that will want to use these areas. Next one, please, Rachel. So when we're talking integrated waste strategy and we're talking all of our practices, our approaches, our projects, a key element of it is sort of showing continuous improvement, continuous learning, and innovation. And innovation in radioactive waste management in Canada does not mean doing something nobody has done before. It often means doing something new in Canada that has been proven to be safe elsewhere. And that's kind of classic example that the NSDF provides of transitioning to a disposal framework is recognized by the government as really important. NSDF is going to be the one that creates the first large-scale disposal facility for radioactive waste, but it's using approaches and it's using all of the knowledge that has been gained throughout the world over the past decades. And on this slide here, we talk about just some of the organizations we dealt with. And I picked these organizations because these were the organizations that the Integrated Waste Strategy team talked about in the past 6 months alone. So there's this continuously dialogue going on in the industry of people sharing lessons learned, sharing technologies. And it is that practice of the philosophy of continuous improvement, of getting better every single year and improving our practices and recognizing that we can learn so much from other people. And if you want to go to the next slide, and including in that, and this is part of what CNL is doing a lot more of, is recognizing the role that the public plays and how Indigenous people and the role that Indigenous people play in helping us plan that future. So from our projects that are undergoing the federal impact assessments, NSDF, NPD, WR1, to our ongoing public commitments through forums such as Environmental Stewardship Council, or our open house in August, or the open houses we had in the communities in November, or things like this, which is a webinar. There are opportunities for us to get feedback from the public, for the public to have a say, and for them to sort of direct us to what they believe and their perspective, and how that perspective can be integrated into our plans for the future. Indigenous engagement, obviously something that is really important to CNL and something that over the past 8 years I've seen personally really increased, and recognizing that it's a journey that we're continuously finding new ways to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into our practices. But I have had the opportunity for the Integrated Waste Strategy to engage with a variety of different groups and nations for this, and by touring them around or giving them a presentation and hearing their questions, it helps us understand what is important to them, what are the factors that we need to prioritize when we make decisions. Because again, the IWS is that framework. So understanding that and then using it as a forum for communication and engagement to sort of say, here's our plan. Does this align with your expectations to what you think we should be doing? And it really is a really interesting dynamic, and it's a really interesting opportunity now where CNL, and this has been going for a while now, we're not just learning from the industry, we're not learning from supply chain vendors, we're learning from them, but now we've got the benefit of really engaging more with the public and with Indigenous peoples across Canada at all of our different sites. Next slide, please. This is my last one. So some key themes of radioactive waste management at CNL operated sites across Canada. So number one is an ongoing and an unwavering commitment to safety and responsible environmental stewardship. And with that, and is the meeting regulatory requirements. Should strike that exceeding, you can't actually exceed regulatory requirements, but the fact is meeting the regulatory requirements is your base. We recognize that we have to continuously optimize our ability to do work safely. And when we're talking about safely, it is for our workers, it is for the environment, and it is for the public. Number two, and this is a theme that really came about with the transition to the GOCO model for CNL, is that we're accelerating our mission to manage those liabilities. So decommissioning, environmental remediation, and waste management are all key elements of that acceleration. And NWMO, with their extensive engagement on their integrated strategy for radioactive waste, one of the key themes that they kept hearing was the time to act is now. That was a message that came all the time to them. And CNL has been doing that. We've really accelerated our work over the past 8 years, and that acceleration is anticipated to continue for at least the next 12 years. And that will sort of put a lot of our historical liabilities in a much better state than what they currently are. Number three is our focus on life cycle planning and working on the transition from radioactive waste storage to radioactive waste disposal framework. And that sort of goes from rolling stewardship of taking it from one storage facility, processing, packaging, characterizing it, making it better, and then putting it in a more modern storage facility, to pulling it from the storage facility, processing it, packaging, characterizing it, and putting it in the disposal facility to sort of end that sort of life cycle for it. Recognizing once it goes into NSDF, it's not walk away from that. It is multiple centuries of monitoring and institutional controls to make sure that it is performing as we expect it to and as it needs to maintain safety. But that's all part of the safety assessment. And when you look at the safety assessment of like 10,000 years, it shows the time frame that we're talking when we're talking life cycle planning. Number 4 is the consolidation of waste at Chalk River until disposal pathways are available. So obviously, one of the earlier slides, we showed the geographical distribution of CNL operated sites across Canada, and the decision was made by the Government of Canada to consolidate the waste at Chalk River for disposal of low-level waste. And for ILW and high-level waste, we're doing the same thing. We're consolidating here because we're going to have the centralized processing facilities to be able to convert that into a disposal-ready configuration. And before disposal, by consolidating it, it allows us to handle it safely and more securely. When you're talking ILW, when you're talking high-level waste, you're talking the need for pretty significant security infrastructure. And having it consolidated at the Chalk River site does allow CNL to optimize that element. Number 5 is our engagement with public stakeholders and Indigenous peoples. And that's, again, not just on our federal impact assessment projects, but that's on a lot of the work that we're doing, and increasingly using the integrated waste strategy as a mechanism for engagement. So rather than go project by project or sort of plan by plan, but showing how it's sort of all integrated together. Finally, and this is something that I think is probably going to be quite obvious based on the discussion thus far, is that CNL is making investments into new capabilities, capacities, and enabling facilities for managing our waste. And there's a huge focus on minimizing waste. So when we're talking low-level waste, we're really putting a big focus on minimizing the amount of waste that has to be managed as low-level waste that goes into the NSDF, where we're putting a lot of effort in diverting that to find ways, is there a way to potentially reuse that to avoid treating it as waste? And it's kind of the CNL approach to the circular economy of waste management, of really implementing that. But the reality is, and this is sort of an important element of the strategy, is that to manage those liabilities in the near term, we need to build up. We need to build the facilities to allow us to manage those wastes, whether it's pre-disposal management or disposal management, such as the case of NSDF. Those new facilities are a key element of the waste strategy. I think that's my last slide, but I see there are some questions, so I will hand it over to Mr. Giardini to start with the questions, and I hope there's some interesting ones here. And I will preface it by saying, if there's some project-specific ones, I probably won't know the answer. If we don't know the answer here, we make the commitment to get back in writing to anybody that did answer the question. But over to you, Mr. Giardini.
Thanks, Sean. Great presentation too. There's a lot of stuff packed in that 40-ish minutes presentation. So the first couple, you touched on them after they were typed up. So maybe we'll just go back a little bit and maybe just explain them again. So question 1 is, how is the CNL integrated waste strategy related to the NWMO's integrated strategy for radioactive waste?
Okay, great question. So this NWMO integrated strategy for radioactive waste, the ISRW, is meant to be a Canada-wide strategy. So that is an umbrella over CNL, with a key note that the ISRW excluded the projects that were currently undergoing federal impact assessments, NSDF, NPD, WR1. So recognizing it applies to all of the other LLW and ILW in Canada, including the AECL-owned waste that CNL manages, the reality is our IWS is realigned to that. So the ISW, the CNL Integrated Waste Strategy, is aligned to the NWMO-led Integrated Strategy for Radioactive Waste. And with that, CNL has been an active participant. We do not lead that. We do not have special standing in that process, but we've participated in the specific sort of workshops for the development of the ISRW. We've had individual members not representing CNL participate in some of the community sessions. So we are very much actively watching that as it evolves and aligning our strategy to that to the extent that it makes sense for us.
Right, perfect. Thank you. The next question is, why is now the right time to start transitioning from storage to disposal?
So I think it's going to go back to the question of the framework that we have in Canada is the government of Canada recognizes now is the time to act, that we should be looking to move beyond rolling stewardship to disposal frameworks. And we look at the rest of the industry where really everybody that's responsible for radioactive waste is making that transition. So that's the one influence. Equally important is the fact that's what we're hearing at sort of a global scale or a national scale when we're talking radioactive waste in Canada from the public and from interested groups, where there's that need to act now. Like I said, that was a theme of the NWMO-led Integrated Strategy for Radioactive Waste. But this focus on minimizing the burden on future generation, which I think we can all agree to, really means that we need to stop doing the approach that's been used in the past of storage. It is very much of moving us to a disposal framework, because that is the permanent end of life solution that prevents us a need of saying, hey, we've got this waste next generation, please deal with it better than we have. So I think now is the right time. It also reflects the fact that we have the technology and we've got methodologies that have been sort of demonstrated to be safe and appropriate for CNL. So I think that sort of whole thing from the government to the people, they're all telling us to sort of act now. So I think it's nice that we're seeing pretty good alignment from so many people saying it's the time to change is now.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Next question is the cover of the IWS document shown on one of the earlier slides is not the same, doesn't look the same as the report downloadable on the CNL site. Does this represent a new revision?
Yes. So publicly available right now is revision 1, and that's what you could find if you Googled CNL Integrated Waste Strategy. That is from 2019. Over the past year and a half, we have completed, or in the process of completing, a pretty substantial revision to the IWS, and that will be Rev 2. That will be published internally next month, so March 2023. Before it goes public, we will have to translate it to French. So that means there's going to be a couple months before we're able to release both versions, the French and English, at the same time to the public. But what you saw on that one slide of the green cover of the IWS, that's what it looks like. That's what we sort of anticipate it will look like when it's published later on in 2023.
Thank you. Next question is, why can't you exceed regulatory requirements as mentioned on slide 18?
So that was my bad to even put the word exceed in that slide, to be honest. So the regulatory requirements sort of communicate the minimum. So the expectation is that you meet that minimum. Going above and beyond still meets it. So that's the reality of it. It's a bit of semantics here, but by sort of setting the minimum that you have to achieve, anything above and beyond still just meets that regulatory expectation. And in CNL, when we're talking the regs, I'm not the best person to talk about waste management regulations. There's people that specialize in that are not on this call. But you look at how far we've come in the past couple of years with sort of Reg Doc 2.1.211.1, and how good that is in terms of presenting more expectations for the regulator to waste owners and producers. So that is why you can't meet it when the regulations are sort of that you optimize practices, that you minimize to the extent possible. You can minimize it all and you're still meeting rather than exceeding, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Sean. So the next one is, to quote from table 3.1, baseline waste strategy from CNL's integrated waste strategy, quote, consolidate used fuel identified as waste at CRL and place it in a safe, secure, and suitable storage until the NWMO adaptive phased management used fuel deep geological repository becomes available. So if this person understands it, some of the used nuclear fuel currently stored at Chalk River is not acceptable as is by the NWMO. What are CNL's plans for the long-term management, that is disposal of these wastes?
So that's a great question. So obviously the near-term plan is to consolidate some of the AECL-Owned inventory of fuel at Chalk River, and I think that was mentioned in the question prelude there. The reality is that the AECL-Owned inventory of fuel, because we're a research site rather than the power reactors, we have some unique types of fuel. Our research reactive fuels that include like uranium carbide and different types of waste like that, different types of fuels like that. Based on the published preliminary waste acceptance criteria for the DGR, those research reactive fuels don't meet the WAC. So what we need to do is we need to develop the capabilities and the facilities to be able to condition those into a disposal eligible configuration. So CNL is working very closely with the NWMO on the waste acceptance criteria, on the safety basis and the safety underpinning for the national used fuel deep geologic repository that's sort of covered under adaptive phase management. But CNL is also looking at the approaches for how we can process those fuels to make them meet that WAC so they can be safe for disposal. And that's one of the key elements of why the consolidation of fuel makes a lot of sense. So rather than create multiple facilities at each site where we might need that capability, you bring it to Chalk River, you have that facility, you've got that expertise that you build up, and then you're able to process it in a way that allows us to end that life cycle, to allow us to dispose of it properly. And that's something that the CNL fuel program is doing right now. It's under Mark Chapman, and there's a lot of work going on there. At our most recent sort of community open houses, we actually had some posters on some of these new facilities that are being conceptualized, but it's really a prime example of how to manage the liability in the near term. We need to build up. We need to build some of these facilities to allow us to dispose of them. So kind of a long-winded answer to that, but hopefully that provided some clarity to the person who asked the question.
Okay, thanks, Sean. We will maybe a couple more or one more, I'm being told. Because we do have another a webinar coming up, and I'm hosting it, so I have to get over to the other meeting. But we will do this one. So, what is the expected process and timeline for determining if the planned DGR will accept AECL's ILW? Now, first, I'll before I hand it off to you, Sean, I'll just say that the NWMO's website does have information on timeline and waste. Other than that, Sean, do you want to add anything?
Sure. So reemphasize that the NWMO is leading that process. By definition of the scope from the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, it included the AECL-owned inventory of ILW in that national strategy. It is currently a draft recommendation. The draft recommendation came out in August of 2022. The plan is to finalize the ISRW shortly after the NRCan policy is finalized. That's planned for sometime in 2023. So say spring, summer timeframe. And then shortly after that, a couple months after that, the NWMO ISRW with its recommendations will be finalized. Then it will be up to NRCan to determine the process and the timelines on actioning those recommendations. So recommendation 2 for the single national DGR for ILW, it will be up to NRCan to decide whether or not to endorse that and action that recommendation. And recognizing that it will be NRCan, that's a pretty big recommendation for Canada. We're talking a timeline of years, whether that's 1 to 2 years or 3 to 5 years, I really can't say, but do recognize it'll be a process that takes a couple of years, and it's something that CNL will continue to sort of monitor and align to the best information that's available, recognizing the continued need to be sort of adaptable.
All right. Thank you, Sean. And thank you for answering all those questions. We will have to wrap up now, but thank you everyone for attending this webinar. For the questions we did not answer, we will provide written answers to everyone, as well as a link to the video. And if you would like a copy of the presentation, you will have to email us at ermstakeholder@cnl.ca. Once again, Sean Gamley, thank you very much. Thanks, Nicole, for the introduction at the beginning, and all the team that helped out in the background. Thank you, and maybe we'll see you in a couple minutes for the next webinar. Take care, everybody.